Mark Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And what we are seeing in Russia today has happened before, with an eerily similar authoritarian playbook. In 1939, as Europe was on the brink of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This non-aggression agreement included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with the Nazis taking some territory and the Soviets taking other parts. We mostly remember it as the time the Soviet Union partnered with the Nazis to carve up Poland. However, Estonia, along with Latvia and Lithuania, fell within the Soviet sphere as part of the deal as well. Now, this agreement laid the groundwork for Soviet domination of the Baltic states. Later in 1939, under significant pressure, Estonia was forced to sign the Soviet-Estonian Mutual Assistance Treaty. The agreement allowed the Soviet Union to establish military bases in Estonia and station up to 25,000 troops on Estonian soil. The Soviets framed this as a necessary step for mutual defense during a volatile period in Europe. However, it was later determined Estonia caved to Russian backroom threats and signed under duress, which significantly undermined Estonia's sovereignty and set the stage for later actions. By mid-1940, the Soviet Union began accusing Estonia of violating the terms of the Mutual Assistance Treaty. They had claimed without evidence that Estonia had engaged in hostile activities contrary to the treaty's provisions. These allegations were vague, but centered on supposed anti-Soviet action and failures to properly implement the treaty. I've recently heard that before. Now, simultaneously, the Soviet Union began a propaganda campaign to justify their increasing demands. They painted Estonia as a nation in turmoil, unable to manage its internal affairs, and claimed Soviet intervention was necessary to maintain stability and security in the region. On June 16, 1940, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum to Estonia, demanding the formation of a pro-Soviet government and the admission of additional Soviet troops beyond those already stationed in the country. The ultimatum was accompanied by the threat of overwhelming military force. By this time, the Soviet Union had amassed significant forces along Estonia's border and in the nearby bases established under the Mutual Assistance Treaty. Facing no realistic alternative and hoping to avoid bloodshed, the Estonian government capitulated. The Soviet troops entered Estonia unopposed, effectively completing the occupation without any direct combat. Once the Soviet troops were firmly in control, Moscow quickly moved to consolidate its grip on Estonia. A puppet government was installed, and Soviet officials orchestrated staged elections. The results of these sham elections were used to legitimize Estonia's incorporation into the Soviet Union, which officially occurred in August of 1940. Estonia ceased to exist as an independent nation and became the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic. So you may already be thinking, there's striking parallels here between the Soviet occupation of Estonia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you would be right. The Soviets claimed their initial military presence was purely for defensive or training purposes and mutual benefit between the countries, though it was clearly a step towards domination. We saw a similar buildup on Ukraine's border in the 2014 Donbass Crimea invasion, and then Russia claimed it was for the benefit of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Then it was just merely training exercises that were taking place along the Ukrainian border in 2022, right up until they weren't just training exercises. Estonia was accused of treaty violations and anti-Soviet activities without evidence, providing a pretext for further demands. Russia did the same thing with Ukraine, claiming Ukraine repeatedly violated the terms of the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, even though they did not. The Soviet Union framed the annexation of Estonia as a natural outcome of Estonian popular will. Does that sound familiar? The exact same things were assessed by the Kremlin of Ukraine. The invasion would be over in mere days to weeks, they said, and they would be welcomed as liberators by grateful Ukrainians. Yet here we are nearly 3 years later. Russia used the security of Russians as a pretext to occupy Estonia, and then again when they accused Ukraine of threatening Russian speakers and their security. Putin even deceitfully claimed the Russian speakers in the Donbass were experiencing a genocide, despite the growing numbers of those moving from Russia to Ukraine. Both the invasion of Estonia and Ukraine involved an overwhelming military presence to force compliance when propaganda and coercion didn't work. Then, just as the Soviets used sham elections in Estonia, Russians organized referendums in Crimea and other occupied Ukrainian territories to claim legitimacy for annexation, with ludicrous favorability numbers. The underlying motive for Russia in both cases was the desire for strategic and territorial gains, cloaked under the guise of protecting national interests or defense. The Estonian people in 1940 did not fight and ended up being occupied by the Soviet Union for over 50 years. They know all too well what acquiescing to Russian demands really means. They experienced it, and there are people alive today that remember it. Modern-day Russia is no different than the 1940s Soviet Union. Estonia knows this. The Hall of Leaders in Estonia features portraits of Estonia's presidents and prime ministers, symbolizing the nation's enduring commitment to sovereignty and democratic governance. 8 separate leaders, prime ministers, presidents from Estonia were arrested or died between 1939 and 1942 to Soviet hands so the Soviets could make sure the right government, the pro-Soviet government, was in place. Estonia made a deal to save lives and prevent war, but 83,000 people, or about 7.3% of their population at the time, died anyways to Soviet cruelty. Tens of thousands of more were wrongfully imprisoned. This is the fate of any European country that decides a deal with Russia to save lives is worth it. So stop suggesting such a foolish policy on Ukraine. Listen to those that have lived it and are telling us the history they experienced under Russian rule. It is not pretty. In fact, it is quite terrible.